So we have an interesting subject at hand today, Shobha. Uh, Shobha, when we were talking earlier, she told me two things. One, that no question is off the table. So that's something that I'm going to kind of remember. And the other thing that she said is that, yes, let's talk about the book, but let's talk about everything else too. And so we're going to do that too. So let me get right to it. Why this book and why now?
Well, this is a book. Before I get to the question, I just want to thank all of you for being here tonight. I want to thank the people of Bangalore who have always supported writers and people in the creative fields, just people who are trying to make something of their lives, not necessarily creative. And the city has always given so much encouragement, support, and love to me personally. Each time I've come, this is the 14th edition of the Bangalore Lit Fest. Shiny, Ravi, Krishna, wherever all of you are, the volunteers, backstage, what a stupendous job they've done, and they continue to do year in and year out. And in this magical setting, magical venue, I just feel so lucky and so privileged to be here. And I also want to thank Indigo in a very strange way. In a very strange way, they brought out the best in a lot of us. It was a huge challenge. And the first thing I said to Shiny, I said, do we have a plan B? And she said, we always have a plan B. And to all the writers who made it, despite the odds, fantastic. It took me 7 hours, 7 hours to come from Pune to here. And well, it was worth the 7 hours. I would have spent 17 to be here tonight. So thank you so much. Why the book? Like the gentleman said, that the carpet needed to be removed, not just things swept under it. And I've been writing the book for, I don't know, in my head for a very long time, because it's a subject that interests me deeply. Not in a in a wink, nudge way at all, because sensuality is a very profound subject, especially for women who do not get the opportunity to even ask themselves the questions that men sometimes, they take it for granted about their needs, their wants, how they want to express all of it. But for a woman, it's our society, not just our society, is structured in a way to discourage such thoughts. So it was a difficult book to write, but I'm just so delighted that I wrote it, because it became a kind of personal search, Santosh. Things about my own self and my own life that I may have suppressed, repressed, old memories came flooding back. My early growing up years, my childhood, and the first sensual awakening. And sensuality is such a vast subject. It doesn't only have to do with physicality. Everything's about the imagination, and it starts in the mind. And then it depends where you want to take it. But eventually, and primarily, it's about the mind. So it was a book that I really loved writing, which I haven't said about my previous books, because most of the time I hate what I've written and I never reread it. So it was a tough book. It was a tough book, but glad I wrote it.
So, would it be fair to say that in a sense, what might have been an undercurrent or an underpinning of a lot of your earlier work, this is what you got down to the core of it and actually expressed yourself in a way that you really wanted to?
Yes, I think that's putting it very well, because it is a subject, like I said, which has preoccupied me for a long time, but the conversations around it are never encouraged. Even today, no one wants to discuss it. No one wants to table it. No one wants to talk about their insecurities, or no one even wants to talk about the joy that sensuality provides. And I just feel it's such an important part of our life. It's such an important component of every person's existence. So why the shame? Why the taboo? Why can't we just be upfront about it? And I feel strongly that Gen Z, with all their complexities, are doing something quite remarkable. They have thrown away all the old molds, And they are getting into the subject in its most primal way, questioning, experimenting, just being themselves, allowing themselves to explore, which was denied to a generation, even one generation before this generation. It was not an option. So I hope it does raise questions. And to understand Gen Z is one of the biggest challenges for people of my generation. But my fascination for Gen Z and their thinking is unending. I have much, much more to learn from them than anything I could possibly impart or teach them.
You know, we've just done some work with Gen Alpha. And with Gen Z, you've seen nothing yet. It just gets more interesting as we go forward. But, we'll come to the Gen Z and the modern sense of sensuality and physicality in a bit. But there is a certain ageism, when it comes to this question and the idea of people of a certain age, being concerned with this subject. For a lot of people is like faintly distasteful, saying, now at this stage we should be, the old trope is the fact that you now think spiritual thoughts. Your body kind of has gone to seed, your senses have dulled. So now it's time for you to kind of think of more saintly pursuits.
Yes.
And yet, of course, at a certain human level, this is a timeless kind of a need.
Yeah.
What do you think, governs this attitude that we have, that this is a subject that is, better discussed by younger people who are in their prime and not really as you grow older?
In fact, it's a subject that senior citizens need to talk about much more. The young are talking about it anyway. But senior citizens, the squeamishness is something that I don't understand, why it's distasteful, because at the end of it all, your desire doesn't come with an expiry date. Desire is always there. It's always present. And if you enjoy beauty with all its power, desire is very much a part of that too. So whether you are 40, 50, 60, 70, I'm 77, I can't say that my body is dulled. I can't say that I don't feel excitement or that I don't look around me, that I don't enjoy watching, younger people maybe who are in love, and it doesn't remind me of my old self. And my husband, who's 85, is a romantic Bengali. So for him, the romance never ends, never, not to this day. So, and that, I think, keeps me on my toes too, because I'm a prosaic Maharashtrian. We are not known for our romanticism. But thanks to him and our partnership, which is volatile, turbulent, but never boring, I also am very acutely aware. And when I'm with my grandchildren, I feel it's important for them also to see their grandparents are not completely minus the joy of holding hands. Tactile is so needed. There's nothing offensive about senior citizens being demonstrative. And why should they be self-conscious? Why should society tell them, you can't hold hands, you can't put your arm around your partner, you can't go to a movie, you can't exchange a quick kiss, you can't be just in bed, just being together in a beautiful way, that everything does not have to be a goal-driven, that you are with your partner and it has to be necessarily sexual. It can be deeply intimate, and you can connect on so many levels by just being gentle and tuned into one another. So it's time to stop making senior citizens just feel apologetic about every aspect of their lives. They have every right to their life, and they have every right to live it exactly the way they want to. And if sensuality is a part of it, bravo and good for you.
One of the most beautiful parts of the book, and we were talking about it earlier, is when you talk about what the sensual means to you, right? And the fact that it's almost like, it's like you see it as a form of attention, as a form of the interest in the finer things, in slowing down things, in being able to savor things. So I think, just that the idea of sensuality as you explore it, could you just, share some of your thoughts about how you see it?
But there is every aspect of our life, and now that if I may say so, I'm in a much more meditative, contemplative, gentle phase of my life, which I don't even recognize myself sometimes. I says, what's happening to you? But in this space that I'm in right now, I am acutely sensitized to even small, tiny, beautiful, like movement of anything that moves me. Like yesterday, I was so exhausted coming from that Pune Lit Fest, which was very intense. I'd opened it, I'd done the opening address, then the airport, then the waits, and the whole thing. And when I was really, really tired, I just said, let me look out and see how high we are or how much more time. And I saw the full moon. It was like it had been created just for me right there. And I was mesmerized. And my first thought, of course, I couldn't do it because there was no way I could communicate it at that minute. I wanted to share that moment with my husband, with my children, with my friends. Just the startling, unexpected beauty of a full moon when you're so tired, and boom, my fatigue vanished. So we cannot not allow ourselves these moments. And we cannot be so desensitized and make every relationship in our life transactional. Nothing in life is actually transactional, nothing.
Let me go to the other kind of a view, of physicality and particularly sex.
Yeah.
I mean, there is an absurdity also that is possible in sex. I mean, you think about it, this is an act of great biomechanical awkwardness.
Yes.
There is nothing beautiful about some aspects of the physical aspects of sex. How do you reconcile? Is that also an important part of how one deals with this subject? Just as much as you savor the beauty, do you also enjoy the absurdity?
The absurdity, there's no denying it. And the act of sex itself is comical. And also it's, for a lot of people, too hurried, too furtive, too secretive, too shameful, especially for women. On the other hand, if you are exposed to, for example, whether it's our sculptures in India, the most beautiful, beautiful sculptures which celebrate intimacy and sex. If you see, and I think I've mentioned it in the book quite a lot, the statue of David, which is perfection, it's like a tribute to the beauty of youth, a young man at his prime. And you can just watch that statue. There's nothing erotic about it, but there is something utterly captivating about the male figure as represented with David. So different moments in your life, you find sex absurd, you find sex exciting, you find sex tiring, you find sex utterly boring, you find sex tedious, you find it a duty. And for most women, and I've talked about this in its plain speak, that for a lot of women in marriages which have been like 10 years or 20 years, of course it's inevitable that a certain dullness creeps into what is considered just maybe a physical release. And for a woman, and I've said that too, and a lot of women have agreed with me, to fake it is much quicker and much more practical and easier. But a man cannot fake it. So that's advantage female. And I don't think there's anything insulting about it. If you don't make the person feel awful about it, you don't make your partner feel that he has let you down, but you want to kind of get on with other stuff. And it's really okay to accommodate one another in a way that's not hurtful. Any act of intimacy which degrades the other, which shows a lack of respect, that is very disturbing. Nothing else. I mean, there's nothing that's taboo, and there's nothing that I would consider off limits, provided it's consensual and both the people involved are enjoying what they're enjoying.
As somebody who's followed, all forms of representation, but certainly cinema, what would be your view? How do you think that how we depict both sex and sexuality and sensuality, which is more erotic, which is slower, which is more languid, in cinema? How has that changed over the years? Do you see something that you find interesting about how it is being represented today?
I'm glad you asked that question because I think one of the most sensual and erotic films which featured Simi Garewal and Shashi Kapoor was Conrad Rook's Siddhartha. If you haven't seen it, it's worth a watch because every frame is perfect. And it is so completely enchanting to see. It's like two bodies, two beautiful, perfect bodies. She's wearing a very elaborate headgear and costumes. Not a costume, actually. She's just covered with jewelry. Rekha attempted something like that in Utsav. Didn't quite work the same way. And I think it was also in Kama Sutra. They tried it. They tried the same, just jewelry. Didn't quite work. But our representation today, it goes from the very poetic and very gentle and appealing to the brutality. Most of it is perpetrated on the woman in the film. And that kind of what is labeled toxic masculinity, it's become almost a cult. Now that is something that a filmmaker and the people participating in those films and the audiences that flock to those films and make them super hits, we have to ask ourselves, why are we celebrating something that is actually hateful and negative? But we are. So even the new film, I haven't watched it, but I definitely intend to. Dhurandhar, I don't know about the sexual aspect of it, but certainly the brutality seems to be on a very exaggerated level. We either over romanticize a relationship and always in the old days, in the films, even up to the 70s and 80s, the woman had to be pavitra and pure. By that, it meant only one thing. She had to be a virgin. And the whole thing was about the conquest, never about understanding, never about sensitivity towards one another. The courtship rituals were all to, in some way, conquer the woman through various acts of either chivalry, gallantry, bravery, or just plain mockery. Because mockery seems to have worked in a lot of our movies, that you mock a woman and it's actually a turn on for her. Don't ask me, I mean, I didn't write those films, but it's something that baffled me. That how could a woman who's insulted, humiliated, and mocked in public fall for the man and see him as a savior? So there have been very perverse interpretations of sensuality in our films, but then our films are diverse. And they do represent so many segments of our society. Not everything is like one big blob that can be fitted into any kind of a box. And we'll continue to keep experimenting. A lot of films, for example, Marathi cinema, Bengali cinema, the old Mughal-e-Azam, that the one scene with the feather. I mean, what can be more? My God, I mean, so poetic, erotic. The promise of it all was something that only a great filmmaker will understand, how often understatement and suggestion leave something to the imagination of the audience. Let them imagine what can happen next. But today's generation generally is in a hurry, so are we all. So what we are getting is what we've ordered. This is what the menu says, and you have just that many choices, and we make those choices.
So we're talking about films. There is this convention that I think is receding, but has been otherwise a kind of a norm in a lot of recent films. The item song. Which becomes therefore this kind of a completely gets airdropped into the film, as has nothing to do with the rest of the film, but is purely therefore focuses on the woman's body.
Yeah.
Do you see that as exploitative? Do you see that there is something else going on there? How do you decode that phenomenon?
No, there's something going on there for sure, and it's money, plain and simple. It's those songs that get the audiences in. They're the magnets. The big difference, Santosh, is this. That in even 10 years ago, we had ladies who performed item songs. They were very good at what they did. Now the lead, they have decided that why should the ladies get the best song? Why should they get all the eyeballs? Why should they be invited to perform and get paid a lot of money to perform at various awards nights and internationally and at weddings? They have hijacked the item song, the lead stars, And a lot of the girls who were so good at what they were doing, the item girls, they're saying this is very unfair to us because though the leading ladies have every offer that they could possibly want of the top movie makers and the top filmmakers ready to sign them for roles we would never ever have a shot at. So this is happening, it's a kind of parallel thing, and it's no longer exploitative because the girls who are participating know exactly why they're doing it, what they're doing it for, and at the end of it all, it's a commercial decision, and everyone seems to be perfectly happy. If there was coercion involved, that's a different story. In the old days, the girls, they came from very underprivileged backgrounds who performed those cabaret items. And, but there was a Helen who was a phenomenon, and she never ever degraded herself. She was never cheap, no matter what she wore, no matter what her moves were. She was Helen, and she held her own, and she still does. So she commands a kind of respect across generations for what she did. She was the original item girl in many ways. What they're doing today is a parody of all of it because there's not that much talent and there's not that kind of discipline for a dancer to show her skills. It's just taking your clothes off and making kind of the old bump and grind routine. And that's about it. And for which they get paid in the crores. So no one's complaining.
So, how does this idea of sensuality stay current? Because some could argue that, this is the traditional notion of romance in a certain sense is based on conventional gender roles, that a man plays a certain role, a woman plays a certain role, she's the little coquette. I mean, there's a whole, everybody knows the tropes that surround it. Now that world has changed, right? So how does intimacy and romance, what are the new codes?
I'm still getting to understand the new codes because I cannot keep a track of the various new categories that have happened in the last couple of years. But there has been a complete almost reversal. Gender roles have been reversed, turned on their heads. And in many ways, it's so liberating and it's so phenomenal because in the past, there could have been thousands of people trapped in roles that society had sanctioned. Today, they don't have to be that. But at the same time, it's the process of redefining those roles has just about begun. We haven't reached a stage, I don't even think a sociologist will know very accurately where we're headed in those terms. And it's quite possible that it should remain as fluid as it is right now. And eventually, we'll come to some kind of an understanding of it's a cataclysmic change that's happening. But in all of this, for all these years, it was women who were deeply disadvantaged. Today, it's no longer that. It is quite the contrary. There are a lot of women I know who are very happy to take the initiative to lead their partner, whether it's another woman or a man. They are free to make those choices. And choice is by far the most powerful word in the universe. When you have choice, it means you have agency over your decisions. So what's happening is a kind of a mini revolution, but every generation has its revolutions. For us, for my parents, the Beat generation in that 70s was a sexual revolution. When Hair was performed in London on that stage with frontal nudity for the first time in the West End, it caused ripples across the universe. Today, no one blinks. And the Kardashians, who are making extremely provocative lingerie with pubic hair as part of the lingerie. So things change. People look at things differently. People view things differently. People judge differently. So we are still in that transitional phase, and let's see where it takes us.
Beyond the traditional genders, now with gender fluidity, the fact that there is a spectrum of possibilities that is being experienced today. Do you think here also are the codes different? Do you have a view on how those norms are evolving when you go beyond conventional sexuality and go into alternative sexuality?
I'm not very confident talking about it. I don't have enough experience, and neither do I have the kind of knowledge to make a statement that is definitive. But I do monitor it. I watch it with a great amount of interest because any social change is telling us a lot about ourselves. And it's always and invariably reflected in our movies and in our music and in our lyrics. In India, it's a very potent way for change to travel. So I see a lot of it. I watch OTT and I watch only to see the representation of the sexes and also what you're talking about, the fluidity that is evident even in their representation in movies and on OTT platforms.
There's a lovely phrase in your book, where you say, "I'm heavy with book," which is, and I just wanted to, beyond this book, I just talking about the process of writing and what happens when you are heavy with book. What goes through, and what is happening at that time?
Well, heavy with book is very specific because I've committed to that book. But there's not a moment in my life, not even this very moment, when I'm not writing. I'm writing, I think, even in my sleep. That never stops. Something or the other, there is an idea, there's someone's sari in the audience, there's an expression I've seen, there's someone who's talking backstage, which I'm listening to keenly. They're normally talking to their girlfriends on the phone when they are not needed. Through all of it, I am creating material for something that may or may not be a part of a book. But it stays, and it stays for a long time. And then suddenly, boom, you say, okay, I think I know what I'm going to do with all of it. And in this case, it was this book. And right now, I have 3, very enticing book offers, but I haven't jumped at any because the choice to write that next book or any book or not write has to be my choice and my choice alone. I don't go by what the market is saying, and I don't go by a publisher saying, and I must tell you an interesting story here, that, we think this book is done so well, so why don't you immediately, the best time, my publisher just told me, the best time to sign the next book is when your new book is doing so well. I said, say that to some other rookie author who will get impressed by that line and sign on the dotted line, but not me. But publishers, and it's important that we raise questions which a lot of literature festivals may avoid. There are many elephants in the room in the publishing industry which are never talked about. And I'll give you one example of a publisher when my first 2 or 3 books were published. And these are all the top agencies in New York and London. And they were very keen, and they kept saying, for your next book, why don't you place your protagonists in New York or in London and have one foreign lover? It has to be, of course, a white man. And that romance and where that goes and their sexual equation, and is it different with a white man with an Indian woman? These were actual suggestions coming to me, which of course I threw out of the window. And I said, I will write my book on my terms, and I'm not going to write to order. It's not like a Zara, you're scrolling through the website and saying, yes, but maybe the next time they'll tweak this design a little and maybe it'll appeal to me a little more. It doesn't work like that. And the dynamics in a writer's mind, every writer has his or her own rhythm. And why they decide to write a certain book, I don't know whether a lot of writers will be able to deconstruct it very precisely and say, this is why I wrote this book. Of course, there are far, far more successful authors who have talked to you at this very festival who have a certain, I don't like to use the word formula, but they have a genre that they specialize in. They stick to that, they're very good at it. But I couldn't write mythology, for example. I couldn't write a crime novel. I flopped trying to write for children. So you know your own limitations, you know what you can do and what you can't do. And it's always better to stick to your gut feeling and to your instinct. And generally, if you do that, and you're sharing your truth without any filters and without self-consciousness, chances are the book will find its readers, because people are always searching for that one authentic voice, not a construct. And a lot of writers like the construct. For me, it's not even an option.
So I was actually about to just say that, this is a book that is bold.
They're just talking so loudly. Please. I'm behaving like Jaya Bachchan, please forgive me. But I can't hear myself because they're talking on the phone. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I was just saying, I was about to say that this book is bold not only because it's explicit, but because it's not afraid to be uncomfortable. You know, it is not afraid to make the reader uncomfortable. In a larger sense, would you say that that is something that might be said about your other work also, that you're not afraid to make people uncomfortable by saying things as you see them?
Santosh, I don't plan it like that. It's not manipulative. I don't start my books, novels, or fiction, non-fiction with the idea that it should cause discomfort. But my entire life has been disruptive, as a disruptor, from a very young age. I wouldn't know how else to do it. So I'm not wearing a cloak in order to write those books. This is how I write. This is what I feel. And you're free to not accept it, or if you find it unpalatable, you're free not to read the book.
No, but I mean, when I talk about the ability to sort of, question the norm or to say things as they are, I would go back to the Stardust days, in fact, right, where I mean, it completely upended the way journalism was looked at, what was thought to be, the idea of how cinema was viewed, how film stars were viewed. It brought in a completely new language.
Yes.
Right, so in a sense, the more informal way of being able to, and a more lived language, is something that I would say in many ways is a Stardust. Much before we started talking about English, there was Stardust.
No.
Really?
Now to correct you a little bit.
Please,
No,
please.
because they started, it was Stardust for sure. I mean, you're absolutely accurate and right. It was street speak that I started to use, and slang, Bombaya slang. Nothing beats local slang. I mean, I'm sure you have your own language in Bangalore, which is very typical in terms of the words you use, even when you're conversing in English. Stardust started that, so they started to call me the mother of English. So it's kind of attributed to me, so I'm the vamp, or I'm guilty, or I've created something wonderful and new, whichever way you look at it. Now I call myself the grandmother of English, because then it was absolutely taken over by the mainstream media. And the very media who used to mock the Stardust slang started to use it in their headlines. The first time that Times of India used Stardust kind of a headline for a political story, I said, wow, I have done something right. Now, of course, it's used so broadly by everyone, and we all have our own version of the Stardust language. Like in Bombaya is a wonderful, like it's a potpourri of so many. It's Gujarati, it's Parsi Gujarati, it's Hindi, of course, a lot of Bhojpuri, Bihari, a bit of Tamil. So many languages that come together to make Bombaya such a unique, it's a language in itself. So sometimes I'm tempted, maybe I should just write a book, the entire thing in Bombaya, but that would be really tough. It's very tough to sustain that, and quite boring also, I'm sure, over 60,000 words minimum.
Coming back to the present, what is in your book? One senses both this admiration for the modern, current Gen Z version of sensuality and sex. One also senses concern, right? Both. So how are you seeing this play out today, and what are your sort of feelings about it?
I'm not sure how many Gen Z people there are in the audience, but if you're there, please accommodate me and forgive me if I'm saying something that may not appeal to you. I was in Pune. I was talking to a young girl, not exactly Gen Z, but a little older, and we were discussing cocktails. She asked me, which cocktails do you like? I said, I only drink Negronis. She says, oh, but why don't you try Samsara Pink Gin from Jaipur? I had not heard of it. I didn't know of it. And I said, oh, that sounds very interesting. How did you discover it? Oh, she said, oh, there was a guy, he was trying to pick me up, it was a clear hookup. And he said, come to my place and I have some great gin for you. So I knew exactly what it meant as this young girl. So I went to his place and we did hook up. And yeah, the gin was great. I said, just the gin? She said, yes, just the gin. So I said, did you exchange names? I said, do you even remember his name? She said, no, it wasn't important. But I remember Samsara gin. That stayed with me. So it is that casual, but absolutely accurate. On the other hand, a 15-year-old boy came to me at the Pune Lit Fest, young, gawky, awkward, like 15-year-old. They're just so charming at that age, so uncertain. He had braces on his teeth, was very shy. And out of all the books that were available, he had picked up The Sensual Self. I thought like it normally happens, he say, I want to give it to my mother, I bought it for my sister or something. So I said, oh, who should I write this book to? Who should I address it to? He said, to me. I said, why do you want to read this book? So he said, because I want to learn about love and I want to learn about truth. I thought, how wonderful that a 15-year-old boy could say that. He had the courage to say it. And not be, not someone laugh at him. Yeah.
Well, my one last question before we open it out. And this is slightly sort of personal question. This is a book which at one level is absolutely tells it like it is. There is no shyness about the mention of vaginas and penises and the clitoris. I mean, you are, but there is one place where it is almost quaintly restrained. Mr. Day.
Oh my God, he is soaring because in a way he's the hero of the book. And he is. And someone asked me, did you write this as a love letter to your husband? I said, don't ever let him hear that. Because he's got a big enough head. Now he'll be telling the whole world, oh, she wrote this as a love letter to me. So it's fine, let's just keep him down to earth and grounded. But he is old-fashioned. And in many ways, maybe I am. My growing up years were in a traditional Maharashtrian family. And the quaintness comes from the fact that I never referred to him by his first name. It's always been Mr. Day. It continues to be Mr. Day. And now all the children have started calling him Mr. Day, which is when we are texting the family group chat, they'll say, oh, has Mr. Day come back from Kolkata? It's not, is dad back? So all my friends call him Mr. Day. I never ever call him by his first name, but he doesn't call me by my first name either. It's always very indirect, a reference, like he's looking for me or send someone to say, where, kahan ho, kind of, hello, where are you? And my parents never called themselves by their first name either. So maybe it's a carry forward of that. And it is very old fashioned, but I kind of like it. I find it very sexy.
On that note, we can open it up. Questions, please. Anyway, there's a hand there.
Thank you. A little applause would help. Thank you very much.
Hey, hi Shobha.
Hi.
I just wanted to know, do you have a take on millennials? When it comes to maybe sensuality, relationships?
I do. And it's all in the book, quite a lot of it, because my children, I have 6 children, and they're all millennials. So I had sort of research material right there at home to observe them and their friends. I find that they're too tired to make love because they're chasing targets, and their relationship, the most abiding, most consistent one is with their phone. They rarely make eye contact, even with their husbands. They would rather play pickleball or padel than say, I'll take the afternoon off and maybe stay in bed. So spreadsheets have won over bed sheets, that's for sure.
Thank you.
There's a question here.
I'm Professor Dr. Aparna Umashankar Raman from National University of Singapore, NUS. And I stay in Singapore, but I'm South Indian ethnically because most of us, like, I'm part Malaysian, part Malayali from Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Malaysia. And I saw you 25 years ago and you just look the same. I don't know how you do this because I've tried anti-aging everything, but I think you're frozen in time. I'm eternal. The second thing is, and the only other one to do that is a South Indian actress called Rekha. But I just wanted your view on South India versus North India, like two different countries. Because I've been outside migrated, so I just see that the perspectives, the way they approaches, everything culturally itself, it's like I can't tell North Indians, like I always trash them, but they're uncivilized from my point of view. But what do you think about South Indian, sort of the romance, because the poets, the greatest epics came from here. So the South Indian concept about and versus the North.
I really don't want to start a North-South war. Neither am I qualified to do it. But I would say that the very polarity is very attractive. I don't see it as negative at all. I find it extremely, very seductive, in fact, because yes, there are so many cultural differences, and maybe the exotic part of both, the North and the South, I like the dynamics of it, because otherwise it's kind of predictable. So I like polarity, definitely myself in my own personal life. I'm from Maharashtra, my husband's from Bengal. Our eating habits, our language, so many things are totally different. And that's the attraction. I mean, I don't think I could ever have married a Maharashtrian. I find them very boring. So, and without poetry, I'm sorry, I don't want to offend Maharashtrians here, but this has been my experience of the Maharashtrians I have met and known. And a lack of spontaneity and a lack of just basic charm. You meet a new person, a Maharashtrian will be busy sizing that person up and down, judging them. It may take 5 years before they smile. So I don't get that. I like the warmth and the way the North Indian, with all their what you may consider extremely loud, crass conduct. There are no filters. And I love the restraint and refinement of the South. Because I find that very erotic and very powerful. Because so much is not said. And just the malipo in the hair is so erotic and so wonderful. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Divya. I'm a huge fan of yours. I've read almost all your books. And Spouses is my favorite as of now. So you mentioned about being tactile and how powerful it is. And I'm a beginner poet, so I know what you actually mean. So you also mentioned Gen Z. So they are very cool and open about, being physical, not necessarily in a romantic way or physical relationship, being friends, or whatever it is. So do you think that the charm of that feather scene and, that just now you mentioned that distance, you have touched, you have not touched. Do you think that there is a dynamic shift in that? Is it affecting the way people are coming together as couples or in relationships?
But I think it's transitional. There's no way one can explain the huge success of Sanyara, because there was innocence in the film, and that that so much was not expressed, and there was nothing that was very explicit, even in the way they communicated their love to each other. And in the book, I've quoted Kalidasa a lot, because I find that imagery so inspiring, that a lover who's separated from his beloved uses a cloud to convey messages of love to his beloved. I just find that so completely romantic. So I've started looking at clouds very differently. Similarly, Japanese haiku, which so much is not expressed and so much is, and there's such depth in what is. If I have a few seconds, okay. To complete the Japanese haiku and the Japanese culture, a friend of mine who was in Japan learning Japanese and wanted to understand, and for the last 5 years, I think a lot of us have fallen in love with the cherry blossom season, and Japan is promoting it, the sakuras, quite aggressively, and I've been twice. I've been lucky to see them both on both trips. this lady asked one of these grand masters, a haiku master, that what is so special about the sakura? What is so wonderful about these flowers? I find the cherry blossom is much sturdier, much hardier. The colors are stronger. They stay on the tree much longer. To me, it's definitely the cherry blossom. No, which is the other blossom? Sakura is? No, 1 second. There are two blossoms. One is the cherry blossom, which is the sakura. And there's the other blossom which also blooms a little later, which also we see it a lot in Kashmir. Apple blossoms. And there's one more. Anyway, the lady's point was that those stay much longer. The Grandmaster's response was the Japanese revere the sakura because it's so transient. You have to admire its beauty in just that 1 week. And then it's gone. Its fragility is what makes it beautiful and poetic to us. And our families go just to enjoy the sakura and nothing else. We picnic together 3 generations just looking at the flowers. And because we know that they'll be gone, that's like life itself. So enjoy that, the beauty and transience of life while you can. And I hope it answered that lady, but it certainly provided an answer to me.
Thank you on that very poetic and beautiful note. Thank you all very much.